Good afternoon, and I am delighted that you came out this afternoon. The purpose of our town hall is to talk about the Kansas City Airport. And I want to say at the outset, you're going to hear today my support for a new airport. But I understand that not everyone sees it that way. In fact, the comments on 10 Central reminded me of that. But the goal of today's discussion is not to arm twist. I am not trying to sell something here to you. This is because the bank has a strong commitment to listening to and hearing diverse views, and it's in that spirit that I want to engage with you this afternoon about this topic. This is an important issue, I think, for the bank. It's an important issue for our city and for our region. And because of that, several area business and civic organizations have partnered to engage and educate the community on the value of a new terminal at KCI. And town hall meetings like the one we're doing here this afternoon are going on around the area to provide information, to address questions that you might have on why a new terminal is needed, what it will look like, and who is going to pay for it. And so I wanted all of you to be part of that conversation. I invited Joe Reardon, who is the president and CEO of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, and Tim Cowden, who is the president and CEO of the Kansas City Area Development Council here today, and they're going to give you an overview of the plans for KCI. But before I turn to them for their presentation, I want to take just a couple of minutes to tell you why I think this is important to the bank and why I think it's important to our community. Let me start with how I think about it for this region and for our city. And I think most of you know that I do a fair amount of travel myself on bank business, mostly domestically, but also internationally from time to time. And I can tell you from that experience that a first-class city needs quality transportation services. Affordable and convenient air service is critical to business. It's also critical to vacation travelers, and I think it's critical to the general economic vitality of our region. Our current airport opened 45 years ago. Today, those terminals and parking facilities can no longer give us the security, the efficiency, the convenience, or growth opportunities that a region of our size needs. We need a modern terminal so that Kansas City can keep pace with other dynamic and growing cities that have already improved their airports significantly. Think about the newer airports just in our 10th district region. Wichita, Kansas, for example, opened a new airport 2 years ago. And they are already seeing the benefits of additional flight options, lower fares, and increased sales revenue from the airport, stores, and restaurants. Omaha, Oklahoma City, and Denver have all continued to modernize their facilities over the past 5 years. And each time I talk to the city leaders, they attest to the value that they've seen. Because KCI has become outdated in many ways, the Kansas City area has lost and will continue to lose certain economic opportunities. When I think about the benefits that might accrue from a better KCI, I think about the jobs, not only those that would be involved in construction, but the more permanent jobs that would come from the new amenities that would be part of that facility. I think about the increase in local tax revenue, the business growth that can come from new or existing companies that would be connected to that airport. I think about the importance of the passenger experience there, having parking that can be closer to the terminal, having more efficient security screenings, even separate arrival and departure areas. And mostly I think about the opportunity to have more connecting flights through our city, which means more direct flights for residents. And I personally think about, as I'll be driving in a few weeks to Oklahoma City, I'd love to see another opportunity to fly instead of drive for those 5 hours. And of course, we all care about who is going to pay for these benefits. I think you'll hear this afternoon it will be paid for by users of the airport through concessions, through parking and ticketing fees, and if you don't fly, you don't pay. So that's how I think about it for our region and for our city. Let me talk about why I think this is important to the bank as well. Because I think having a first-class airport does connect to the work we do here on behalf of the public. Last year, bank employees in Kansas City and our branch offices logged more than 3,200 trips through KCI while on bank business. And employees from the 11 other Federal Reserve districts flew into Kansas City some 1,200 times. We also hosted a number of guests for programs in our conference center who came from around the country and from around the world. Research shows that airports shape business location and economic development in the 21st century as much as highways did in the 20th century, railroads in the 19th century, and in fact, you can go back and look at seaports in the 18th century. And you will find that a vision for transportation, if you look at our own history, played an important role in 1914. There was an organizing committee that came out of Washington, and they traveled around the country to make a decision about where the 12 regional feds should be placed. When they came to Kansas City, they arrived by rail, and they noted in their report that the newly built Union Station looked to be a hub of commerce for the region, having been built to handle more than 1 million passengers. As one of the 12 cities in the country that is fortunate to have a Federal Reserve Bank, Kansas City has a significant interest in remaining a hub for economic development, and having a vital airport is critical, I think, to economic growth and development of cities and regions such as this one. So for those reasons, I am one who wholeheartedly supports a better KCI. I think the business case for a new consolidated terminal is sound. I think it will be good for the Kansas City economy, and I think it's good for our bank. So now that I've shared with you how I think about this, I want to invite Joe Reardon and Tim Cowden to the stage and to thank them for their leadership on this very important initiative. They are going to give you more information about why we need a new airport, what's being planned, how it will be funded, and then we're going to open it up, and you will have a chance to ask your own questions. So please welcome Joe and Tim to the stage.
Thank you, Esther, very much. Thank you. It's great. It's really nice. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We're absolutely thrilled to be here. Esther, thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to come before you to talk a little bit about Kansas City International Airport and its importance to the future of Kansas City. I'm Joe Reardon. Tim's here with me, and we're going to take you through a whirlwind tour of a business case for a new single terminal. And Esther did an amazing job of encapsulating a lot of what I think has driven the business community to come before you today and what we're passionate about relative to the future of Kansas City and the airport's importance to it. We start with this slide, the why slide. About a little over a year ago, as many of you know, Mayor James pushed the pause button on considering a new single terminal at KCI. And at that moment, the business community really came together, and we made a commitment to deeply understand what was going on at the airport, its potential for our future, and how it was connected to our economy. We spent time with the airlines, with the aviation department, with TSA. We investigated things to take a look at it. And one of the elements that we fast came to conclude was when the pause button was pressed a year ago, a little over a year ago, it seems like the conversation had devolved to the point where it was more about how many steps you had to take and which side of the wall you were on and had the restrooms been cleaned lately, and less about what the economic impact of an airport means to a region and a city like Kansas City. So we started looking at the components of that. It's tied to economic development, the ability to attract flights and direct flights to a city. And every year, the Chamber sponsors a leadership exchange trip to another metropolitan city to see what they've done. And last September, we traveled to Dallas-Fort Worth. They told us a lot of things, but we brought home two things relative to aviation and its connection to their city that we thought were important to ours. The first was, in every economic development conversation we had with them, they nearly almost led with the fact of showing a map of the United States, and it had Dallas there, and they made the claim that Dallas was in the center of the country. Now, that was a little tough for us to swallow, being Kansas Cityans, I will tell you.
Texas hubris, right?
That's right. So that kind of, we had to swallow hard, but then they showed this lines to every major city in the U.S. And their pitch to attract business and people was the fact that you could reach any major U.S. city in 2 hours or less on an aircraft, commercial aircraft, from Dallas-Fort Worth. They used that to pitch and to attract Toyota North America's headquarters from California to Frisco, just north of Dallas proper in the Dallas metro area. It was very persuasive to us. The second thing that they talked about was that their ability to attract international flights had a direct tie to their economy, that every direct flight that they were able to attract to the Dallas-Fort Worth area had the economic impact of a Super Bowl on an annual basis, $250 million, that those connections to the world mattered to their day-to-day economy in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. We brought all that back in all of our due diligence, and we became passionate about making sure that we engage the public and business in a conversation not so much about how or who or what, but why. Why is a single terminal fundamentally important to the future of this Kansas City region that we all call home?
First off, I've got to thank you, Esther, because you did a great job leading in for us. And there's nothing more important to my organization as the lead seller and marketer of the Kansas City region than this airport, than this terminal. And we're going to speak a lot today, over the next 30 minutes or so, about the reasons and the rationale why. But before we get into that, I want to ask a question. How many in here are supportive, based on what you know right now, for a new terminal at KCI? Okay.
Many.
How many are just dead set against? Okay, there's a few, there should be. And how many are on the fence? Okay. Now, Joe and I have done now close to 60.
This is number 60.
Number 60 of these presentations.
Not that we're counting.
Across the region. And I got to tell you, this is maybe the biggest crowd.
It's close to it has to be.
By far the nicest room, because last Thursday I did one out in Overland Park with about 8 people. But the point is,
wherever two are gathered, Tim and I will be there.
We're committed. And you get both of us.
That's right.
I love doing this with Joe. All right, well, let me back up. So Joe talked about the why. And that's so important. Today we know, if you're reading the Star, there's a lot about the what and the how. It's going on down the street right now. But what's happened over the last 7 years or so is that every time, in 7 years we've been talking about this, every time we'd move forward with some discussion about KCI, the why would get swallowed up by the what and the how. No one or no groups were out here talking about the why. And why is the most important question you can ask about anything, is why should you do it? So it's really important for us to talk about that we're focused on the why. We'll talk a little bit about the what and the how. And Joe and I are really good about sprinkling personal anecdotes in these presentations, so bear with us on those, because I'm sure you have some of those yourself that you could share. But it's about the why. And the other thing is to remember that the political campaign, if we assume that a vote will come in November, and that's an assumption, probably a pretty good assumption, that there will be a political campaign that will ramp up, and it'll be traditional, and you'll radio spots and the whole bit. But this is informational. This is not a political campaign or anything like that. What we're talking about today is informational. We think that's really important. Now, I'm going to charge into this, and Joe and I go back and forth. We love KCI. I think one of the issues maybe in the past 6 or 7 years, there was so much KCI bashing. I love KCI. KCI has been a great terminal. It serves as a great airport, has now for almost 50 years. But there's something to keep in mind, that airport and terminal are not necessarily synonymous. So when you look at that aerial there, KCI is 10,000 acres. There's been billions of dollars worth of investment made in KCI over the years. What we're talking about is a new terminal. Now, a very important aspect of the airport, but geographically, a small set of buildings when you think about the entirety of 10,000 acres. So that's what we're talking about today. And Mayor James had a great quote before I turn it over to Joe. That KCI, and again, love it. KCI for the last 40, almost 50 years, has been about getting Kansas City out to the world. And this next terminal, this new terminal, has to be about getting the world to Kansas City, much like Union Station was our entry to the world back in 1914 for that very important group of decision makers, why we're even here today. Joe?
Tim brings up a great point about the terminal. I want you to just think about this because it resonated with us when we started doing our work. This is a really unique place because it functionally has to be open 365 days a year, nearly 24 hours a day. There's no seasonality. This isn't a sports venue. It's not a convention center. It has to be open. If it were to close tomorrow, it would harm us economically and many of us personally. So it requires ongoing attention and ongoing investment. It can't be walked away from. The second thing I think that struck us about the terminal itself was that nearly everyone in Kansas City has been in this building. And most people have an opinion about it, which I know all of you do too, and we have stories about it. But that's pretty unique. If you think about it, there's more people that have been inside this building than have been inside of probably nearly any other common public building in Kansas City. Certainly more people that have been in the airport terminal than have been in their own city hall, for instance. And so everyone has a connection to it, whether they're a very frequent user or an infrequent user. So we have 6 points that we want to make with you today and in the research that we had done that we think are important to evaluating the business case for KCI. Its importance to access and destinations as an economic driver, convenience and amenities. We'll dive into that a little bit. It gets into a little bit of the what and the how, but it's important to understand in the context of the why. Security and technology is a big issue for every airport and for all of us as we use aviation services. The fact that we're a major league city, and you can see that outside your window, and that we need to think of ourselves as a city that's in competition with others. And then finally, as Esther did a great job of explaining, talking a little bit about the fact that terminal construction in the United States is paid for by the users of the terminal facilities themselves, not by general tax dollars. First one we want to talk about is access and destinations. I won't go through these bullet points. I want to tell you what we discovered in the work that we did. A year ago, when Southwest Airlines, the largest carrier at KCI, testified at City Hall not far from here, they told the City Council that they were throttling back the number of flights that they were adding to Kansas City because of the poor experience that passengers were having, particularly with transferring, and the inefficiency from getting from one flight to the other inside the terminals at KCI. They told us that, too, when we met with them. And we dug in to understand what that might mean for Kansas City or what it's been meaning for us in the recent past. So over the course of the last year, Southwest Airlines added 2 new flights in Kansas City, one to San Antonio and one to Austin. And the aviation department was helpful enough to get us data to generally know that there's enough folks starting in Kansas City daily that if Southwest does a good job of selling their tickets, they can fill the aircraft up to the point where we might even be uncomfortable and fly that plane down with just Kansas Cityans to those cities in Texas and make money, right? So that's fine, all good and fine, 2 new flights for Kansas City. Over the same period of time, the next major airport close to us, to our east, in St. Louis, Southwest added 12 new flights. And we looked at the data there too, which we were able to do. 2 of those flights looked a lot like the 2 they added here. So if Southwest sold tickets at the right amount of money, they could fill the plane up. and fly to those destinations and make money by just having St. Louis passengers there. Fully 10 of those flights were not filled by solely St. Louis passengers. We came to understand that they were filling those flights with 20, 30, 40 folks starting in St. Louis. They were using St. Louis in its single terminal configuration, not a very glamorous airport, by the way, as many of you know, as a great way to transfer passengers. And they were adding flights to do just that. Every one of those transfer flights that Southwest thinks of them as is a direct flight to St. Louis. And the pattern repeats itself this year. 1 new direct flight added in Kansas City, 7 more in St. Louis, with 4 more gates opened in St. Louis this year to accommodate Southwest flights. And Southwest told us they just don't consider St. Louis to be that much larger of an aviation flying public as Kansas City. We know that if investing in the future of our single terminal is important to thinking about more direct flights, a single terminal design allows us to be more competitive to try to capture those connecting flights. Southwest hasn't guaranteed new flights. No business, I think, would say 5 years out exactly what they're going to do. But we know we're not competitive for those opportunities today. The second thing we learned, which was equally interesting to us, was that every day in Kansas City, about 300 people start here and end up somewhere in Europe. To expand that thinking just a minute, on a daily basis, 1,000 people start in Kansas City and end up internationally somewhere outside the United States. But we focused on the 300 starting in Kansas City and ending up in somewhere in Europe. And in modern aviation, mid-sized cities of our size with those numbers can compete for direct daily flights to Europe. And in fact, our aviation department is trying to get these flights to occur. As you might imagine, we're on a short list, 3 or 4 cities that have that haven't got a direct flight yet. St. Louis is on that list, by the way. New Orleans was on that list. And interestingly enough, less people fly on a daily basis out of New Orleans than here. They landed a direct flight on British Airways 4 days a week to London Heathrow. So we're in competition for these flights. Now, I want you all to imagine everyone in here has been in the terminal. And we heard Southwest saying it was a rough experience to transfer passengers from one flight to the other in the current configuration. Imagine unloading an aircraft capable of flying internationally with up to 300 people on it, 767 or 787, unloading those people into the current KCI terminal and processing them through customs and immigration. It would be extremely challenging, if not impossible, in the current configuration. And why is that important to know? Because there are other cities, like Indianapolis, for instance, that has a modern airport capable of international flights that are outpitching a direct flight, trying to get one in competition with us. So direct flight opportunities exist both nationally and internationally, and the design of the terminal can have a factor in how competitive we are in trying to land those flights.
Nashville, just last week, scored a nonstop flight to London on BA. In Nashville, Indianapolis, Austin, Texas, those are the markets that Kansas City is competing with. Charlotte, North Carolina, Columbus, Ohio. So we're not operating in a vacuum. We know how great Kansas City is and the potential that we have with regard to air service to Europe. But those other markets are pitching, and they pitched, and they scored last week. Now, we talk a lot about Southwest, but that's not to say that Delta and American and the others out there are not important. But Southwest has the largest market share to KCI. So we will sprinkle our anecdotes a lot about Southwest. But Esther was talking about the flight that she'd like to have to Oklahoma City. Well, if Bullard had Oklahoma City in its district, that's where those flights are. Because they moved the flights to St. Louis, those nonstops that Southwest used to serve Oklahoma City. Same to Tulsa.
And I'll just mention, but I'll sprinkle in one anecdote here. This matters not just because of new destinations, but frequency of direct flights. So I periodically have to travel to Washington, D.C., Tim does too, to do some of the work that we do. In my last trip there, Southwest, I fly Southwest to D.C., they have direct flight to Reagan National, which is really the most convenient place if you've flown there. And they have a direct flight in the morning and the evening, both ways. So last time I was there, it was a Wednesday. I flew out in the morning. I got there. You get there pretty early, which means you can get right to work, and then did a dinner that evening. And Thursday morning, I had a breakfast, but I had to get back here to Kansas City for an event Thursday night. Well, the Southwest direct flight is actually pretty much towards the end of the business day. I couldn't take it. So I had to take a connecting flight midday to get back for the evening event. So I had to transfer. Can you imagine where I had to transfer? St. Louis, Missouri. Oh, it almost made me sick after knowing this data, right? So the frequency of these flights, they had the midday flight. And it made it even worse when I saw a bunch of people get off the plane and traipse down to the Kansas City flight right with me. It wasn't just St. Louis people that were flying back to St. Louis in the middle of the day. We were transferring there.
You know, one thing that cannot be minimized is the economic impact that the construction of this new terminal will have on the Kansas City region. Now, I know there's some in here that do impact models and analysis probably every week, every day. It's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that at a minimum, 8,000 jobs are going to be created. That's conservative. We're not out there saying that multiples of that, but we know that 8,000 jobs are going to be created, and likely, very conservatively, more than that. That's over a 4 to 5 year period. These are good jobs, from the design element all the way through construction. It will have a very positive impact on our economy, and we can't forget that. Now let's talk about the impact of corporate headquarters. Just in the last 18 months, 2 companies have publicly stated that Air Service was a driver in their decision to relocate their headquarters out of this region and out of your district, in our district. One of those was Beringer Ingelheim up in St. Joseph. Now, there were other aspects to that. The company was merged with another, so it wasn't just Air Service, but more so than that, it was the experience that their customers and their employees have and had coming in to KCI. Now, let's be just frank. Our terminal, a city's terminal at the airport, should never be a reason that it even comes up. But the executives came in and told us that you've got to fix this because it was embarrassing for our customers to come in and have to sit out there in those terminals. They were telling us this in their exit. Should never, ever lead to that point. Grundfos, another company headquartered here, moved to Chicago for international service. Now, we're not going to have international service to the level of Chicago. We're not saying that. But certainly what Joe said earlier, 300 people who get on a plane every morning at KCI with a destination somewhere in Europe, we can compete and win those flights. And that will certainly be a benefit for our area. Joe?
This might be the most fun that we have with you this afternoon because of some of the pictures we'll show you in just a few minutes. But obviously, in thinking about the why, we can answer some questions relative to what happens at KCI today and what the expectation is, and maybe give you a sense of some information you didn't know before. So first, and Esther mentioned this, we're the largest U.S. airport in the United States that has yet to separate arrival activity from departure activity. So if you go to an airport of our size or larger as your destination, you'll experience a place where the drop-off activity is separated from the pickup activity, and likewise that activity inside the terminal is separated as well, making that a much easier thing to navigate for those that are accessing the airport both individually as well as dropping or picking someone up. Parking has become a major convenience issue at KCI. So as we stand here today, Monday's sort of the last day of the week that if you're flying on Southwest and you're going to park in the parking garage at Terminal B, starting either sometime tonight or sometime early tomorrow, the digital sign will say that parking garage B is full, but they have valet parking available for you. And that's because the 4,264 structured parking spots that exist today at KCI are actually garages B and C combined. So we're underparked relative to the use of the airport because it continues to be used vigorously relative to that experience at Terminal B. A new single terminal, as the city has called for, would create a new parking structure with 6,500 spaces directly across the street from the terminal itself, remedying the issue, the midweek issue that exists every week now at KCI at Terminal B. There are other things that simply aren't feasible right now at KCI and that are missing. So we're the largest airport in the United States that doesn't have a USO for our men and women in service. And yet most of you in this room understand that the military is a major user, one of the most major users of KCI. Not just Fort Leavenworth, but Fort Riley uses KCI. Whiteman Air Force Base does as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about amenities. I think one of the things that was out there a year ago was some skepticism that there was some interest in building a shopping mall at KCI. And I would tell you that nothing is further from the truth relative to our evaluation. What we want to talk to you about are amenities that make the terminal livable. So how many of you have flown to Dallas Love Field? Okay, many of you have. So I have a 13-year-old son. I have two boys. And I like to do a father-son trip with them. And Connor's 13, so, that was this year. So we flew down to see the Royals play the Rangers. They lost on Friday night. And then we saw Sporting KC play FC Dallas, and Sporting lost on Saturday night. So it wasn't a great weekend for sports, but it was great.
He's not going anymore.
I know, right? Connor's
Joe
like,
stays
we
home.
Shouldn't go. Connor loved going out of town, but he wasn't so sure it was good for the teams. So on our way back, we decided to, we flew through Love Field. We got there early enough. We got through and we were able to go and order a Whataburger, which is, unique to Texas, or at least that part of the country. Connor wanted that. And we actually sat down at a table across from one another and had lunch after clearing security. Now, I want you to think about maybe your last experience, and I'll pick on Southwest again because we so frequently use it, all of us. If you wanted to do that at Southwest tomorrow with somebody in your family, you'd be up in the Pork and Pickle. I've tried that. It's kind of tight up there. There's the little small Mexican restaurant that has about 30 seats that I never can seem to get into. Or, unfortunately, the last time I had to get lunch at KCI, I was in the line for Starbucks, which is in competition with the two small restrooms next to there. You guys know what I'm talking about, right?
They're all shaking their heads. They know.
So I got my sandwich and promptly sat down in a chair that is far less comfortable than the ones that you have in here and promptly ate my sandwich on my lap. That's the experience many times at KCI. We're talking about amenities that are not a shopping mall, but that make the terminal livable. That when you're here for business or with your family or someone else, that you have an opportunity to sit down at a quiet moment and have a sandwich, charge your phone, or get on your laptop. Those experiences are difficult, if not impossible, in our current terminal configuration.
An important point to remember, Joe was making it, is that this new terminal is going to be right-sized for Kansas City. It's going to fit with Kansas City. And yesterday, my wife and I flew back from Denver. So part of the district, fly in and out of DIA, right? Okay. What an economic engine that's been for the Front Range of Colorado. We know that. But who have spouses that sometimes listen to what you do at work but probably tune out about half of it? My spouse is one of those. So we're coming in yesterday from the rental car depot, and we're riding along the bus, and we get through security, and they're going to change the security at DIA, but it's pretty much a hassle. And we're trying to get through security, and then we get on the train, and we're going out to Concourse C, and my wife turns to me. Luke Jordan knows my wife. She's pretty blunt, isn't she? Okay. Luke's best friend of my oldest son. So he knows my wife. She looks at me and she says, "You're not talking about bringing DIA to Kansas City, are you? We don't want this in Kansas City." I said, "Absolutely not." And I reminded her of Love Field. And that's so important, that what we're going to have here is not DIA. We're going to get some of that economic engine from it, like that, but it will be right-sized for Kansas City. And if you look at the current KCI footprint, so this is getting into a little bit of what, but we all know that B and C are open combined, 750,000 square feet, those two. A was shuttered in 2014, okay? Why was it closed? Well, you all deal with businesses every day. Nobody's going to pay for inefficiency. The airlines aren't going to pay for inefficiency. So with consolidations and mergers of the airlines, just think about 10 years ago, how many more airlines there were then than are today. Continental, now United. U.S. Air, now American. I could go on. So they closed A into B and C. So where's all this going to fit? Moving forward, this is what we're looking at. The new single terminal on top of where A is, with 6,500 new parking slots right across the way there. You'll keep B parking. And B parking is important because right now, I didn't know this before we got into all of this discourse, is that the employees of KCI, and there are thousands, every day park way out, and they have to take a bus. And there's a cost to that. It's inefficient. So B would be, that parking would remain open for the employees, and I think that's important. But you look at the close-in parking, where it's going to go, and during construction, B and C remain open. Unlike LaGuardia or LAX that you probably go in and out of from time to time, what a hassle it is with new construction on top of the existing terminals, we'll have that separated during that time.
35 gates is what's called for, 35 to 42 gates in the proposal that, or the proposals that are being submitted to the city, which is roughly depicted in this graphic. I'll note, because there are some people that are saying, well, you're downsizing KCI. Nothing could be further from the truth in that respect either. There's 18 gates at Love Field, but because it's designed correctly, Southwest flies 180 daily flights, 10 flights per gate out of Love Field. That's more flights than we fly out of 33 gates in the existing terminal configuration that we have in B and C. So 35 gates in a single terminal configuration will allow us to be very productive and attract more flight capacity than we have today. And by the way, the 3 runways that exist at KCI are absolutely superior in every way. There are cities larger than us that would love to have the runway availability that we have. So the rest of that aviation backbone that exists at KCI is really strong and would be able to handle the traffic that we would hope we'd be able to attract to KCI.
Talked about this earlier, but this is a really important point. It's a bit embarrassing, too, that Kansas City, by far, is the largest city with a terminal that still mixes arrivals and departures when you're driving in. So my wife and I had to navigate that yesterday. People who are dropping off passengers and you're picking up passengers. It's a mess. Now, it's something that we've just gotten used to here. But the new terminal will have separate levels for arrivals and departures, as it should be. Again, a little bit of the what, but very important. Security and technology. Nothing has changed more in air travel in even the last decade, going back almost 50 years, than security. So the day after KCI opened in 1972, look out over the crowd, there's a lot of young people, but a few with gray hair like me. Remember what was happening in air travel in the early 1970s as it related to security? Hijackings, gentleman right there. The day after KCI opened, this wonderful design. We just drop off right at the curb and walk right in with no real security. Get on your plane. That's why it was designed in the early 1960s. The day after it opened, there was a hijacking of a plane from New York to Cuba. And from that day forward, through 9/11, all the way through today, all that we deal with, these terminals have had to go back and forth to flex as much as they could to meet new technology and the new threats. This new terminal will be as cutting edge as anything in the world as it relates to security and technology. Any new terminal that's built today in the United States or any of the developed world will have that. And 376 million people have flown out of KCI since 1972. It's tripled. It's tripled. Joe and I love this picture. So
soak it in for a second. 1972.
Soak it in. Go on the Wayback Machine and look at that in 1972. I remember the parquet floors, but how open it was. And then we know what we experience a lot of the time out there today. I don't know if you can see that poor guy, that big guy sitting there with his hand in his pockets in the white short. He has a look on his face. He's not coming back to Kansas City. But that's what we have. And that's not reflective of all the great things that are going on in Kansas City.
You know, we give kudos to the aviation department. I mean, first of all, there was a vision at KCI in 1972, and it was a really wonderful one. And I remember as a kid dropping my dad off and being able to run into the terminal with him and going all the way down to the jetway literally before someone would stop you, you know. So everyone had unimpeded access to the terminal. But as all the security issues happened, the terminal had to be literally cut in half with the wall. And once the wall went up, the hold rooms became 36 feet deep. And everything else had to be replicated in that 36 feet. The restrooms, the sandwich shop, the place to buy something. And so you got, over that period of time, we went from 3.8 million passengers to 12 million this year likely. So more passengers than ever in smaller and smaller and smaller spaces, necessarily so.
Keep going.
So I like these pictures, too, because they just show typical experiences that can happen at KCI. So the one at the top, I'll only talk about the one at the top. It's kind of difficult to see. But this is a gate area where there are two airlines that serve the gate area, Spirit and Frontier. And Spirit has a flight to Las Vegas that you may pay for in other ways because it's pretty cheap. And then Frontier flies to Denver and a lot of other places. But the important thing to think about here, and I was just talking to someone that was in this gate area recently, both of these airlines fly aircraft that have 135 seats or more. Frontier's starting to fly a daily flight in with 240 seats on it. The hold room has 80 seats total. So you know this hold room it can't handle the capacity of one flight, let alone two. The aviation department, kudos to them, popped open the hole in the wall where the two pieces of glass are. That's one of those Mexican restaurants. You can now access that. I think that gives you like 30 more seats. So you still can't even sit, you know, the number of passengers on a single flight. And that challenge is replicated all over the terminals as aircraft continues to be larger. And in the aviation industry, more people are flying, and the airlines have figured out how to fill the flights completely up.
If you look at, again, the concept of a new terminal, this is what likely pretty close to what we'd have post-security. Open and all that you'd expect. All the travel that you do, you know. But again, what's really going to be, I think, so impactful is this will be a reflection of the quality of what we have right now in Kansas City. You think about just the last decade. All the investment that's been made, the Sprint Center, Performing Arts Center, the stadiums, on and on and on. And we haven't touched, really, KCI since the early 2000s. And it's the most important asset, I think we can make a case, of any of those as it relates to commerce and our economy. And I guess we've saved the best for last, right, Joe?
That's right. So Esther did such a great job of talking about peer cities around us that already have made investments or continuing to make investments. So we'd like to compare ourselves to larger cities, but if you look at cities that are our size and smaller around Kansas City, the investments they're making in attracting more flights is actually something we all ought to be concerned about, because the catchment area for KCI is very large. We count on passengers from Des Moines and nearly as far away as Wichita and Topeka and out into Missouri to be part of our passenger base that justifies the number of flights that we have today. So we can't fall behind relative to the investments that are being made. And the other thing to be said about this, and many of you in this room are young, this is an investment for future generations. This is going to be those generations' airport. And we want that airport and that investment to be competitive with anywhere relative to the kind of service that can be provided to Kansas Cityans, to maintain the quality of life that either kept us here, all of us in the room, or attracted us here, is tied also to those assets that allow us to function individually and in the business environment. So too with this airport. So too with the ability for us to reflect the culture of Kansas City. Story about Union Station is incredible, and Tim and I get to work there every single day. We're not advocating for something as opulent as Union Station, but to hear Esther read that the entry into Kansas City mattered, it made an impact on those that were deciding what would happen to the future of our city, is exactly what we're talking about relative to a smart investment in KCI and what it might hold for future generations here as well.
We all know that in business or anything, first impression is really, really important. But that last impression is even more so. And is our terminal right now the kind of first and last impression that we want to leave with those that are considering our region to relocate their business or to bring their talents? I think it's not. And I think at the polls coming up in November, more than likely, I think that'll be reflected. But we'll have something that, again, will be truly reflective of the quality of our region.
We want to get to questions, so I'm going to try to move through this fairly quickly, and Esther did a great job of framing this, and I think you're going to read quite a bit about this in the coming weeks, too, because it's an important point that will be made by the city. The fact of the matter is, as I said at the beginning, that if you don't use the airport, you don't pay for it. There's no general tax dollars that are inside the terminal or used for terminal construction. And so it means that everyone in this room, regardless of whether you live in Kansas City, Missouri or not, or whether you're going to vote on this or not, we all are participants in this by way of using that airport. It also means that when you return from somewhere else, you're paying for their airport as well. That's how the system works. The airlines have made a strong commitment to being here because it's through some of the fees that are generated on their tickets that the cost of the terminal gets paid for. This is a challenging slide to read, but I will tell you in a breakdown that's much easier to read here that the cost per passenger for the use of the terminal at KCI today is one of the lowest in mid-sized airports at about $7. A better KCI, a new single terminal, would take you to somewhere around $9, which still puts us in the 50% range. St. Louis, where Southwest is rapidly adding more flights than they are in Kansas City, actually is far more expensive to use on a per-passenger basis than KCI as well. So what's being proposed to move forward allows us to continue to be very competitive, even in the cost side of things, relative to the airlines and attracting flights and maintaining service that we have.
This number matters to the planners that work for the airlines. This matters. And think about this. Look at the cost for Southwest to run flights through St. Louis versus Kansas City. That tells you all we need to know about the poor customer experience that we have or their customers have in Kansas City versus there. They're paying more. Question that always comes up, well, what will the impact be to my fares? Our fares are dictated not by this. They're dictated by demand. They're dictated by fuel costs. And I'll give you some support to that. So Indianapolis opened up a brand new terminal, 2008? And since that time, fares for passengers leaving Indianapolis have gone up at what? The national average. In Kansas City, during that same time, our fares have gone up what? The national average. Okay? This matters, but it matters to the airlines. Our fares are dictated by these externalities that you all know very well running this bank and dealing with all the companies that you do in your district.
So those are the 6 points. We want to open it up for questions before we conclude, so we're glad to do that. And I think there's going to be, I don't know if there's going to be microphones, I think, or someone's going to be able to facilitate that because it's kind of tough for us to see where some of the questions are. So thank you. Yes, ma'am.
If it's voted for, what would be the timeline for the new airport to open?
Question that she asked, the timeline. More than likely, if it's voted and we believe passed, say in November, you'll see construction next year. And depending upon whether or not the financing is public or a private placement, private's going to be faster. I've read things, heard things, maybe 4 to 5 years. Public might be a little bit longer than that, but started next year, more than likely, and run over that time frame.
So that's what's nice, 4 to 5 years, but you still can use B and C kind of unimpeded. That's important relative to livability for all of us. Yes.
Let's say that the new terminal was wildly successful and business went up and expansion was needed. Is there a plan for expansion in addition to the current plan?
So the current minimum requirements of the city are 35 gates, but easily expandable to 42, which in the gate world that's quite a bit of a jump, which would take you to a pretty big expansion. Beyond that, what we've heard generally from the city is that the proposals will be able to be expanded beyond the 42 gates if necessary in the future as well. So you won't be hamstrung into, we won't have a situation where you won't be able to get the flights because you can't build enough gates.
Okay, so I'm assuming this is on. Over here in the corner.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Great information. This is a lot of information us in Kansas City probably haven't heard on the radio, but I want to go back to something that was part of last year's discussion, which was the airlines had actually attested to if we improved the airport, they wouldn't bring more flights in. So has that changed, or is that, I mean, the only other white elephant I would point to is Sprint Arena that currently doesn't have a basketball team or a hockey league or anything else we were told it might get.
Fair point. And to answer the question as best as we can with regard to airlines making a commitment to service, they won't. They're not going to make any additional commitments for new flights. But what they will say, and have told us, and Joe said this in his comments, is that they are throttling back on any growth in Kansas City, and they're moving it to other markets like St. Louis. Now, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in the world, what have you. But the airlines that all serve KCI have stepped up and said, we're going to support a new terminal. The question that comes up often is, well, what about renovating the existing? The short answer to that is, the airlines don't support that. They want a new terminal. They're the ones that are paying the lease. They're the tenant, right? So that's very important. A lot of discussion over the last 6 or 7 years about renovation. Really a moot point. Cost will be likely that or above a new, but the airlines don't support it because it's not efficient. And we certainly don't, because it doesn't lend to anything that we would want with regard to future growth. Joe, anything?
The only thing I would say is maybe a little bit different observation or response to your question, which is I think there's something unique going on in aviation in Kansas City today. If you look at it, I don't think this has happened in the near past for us, but the largest carrier now in the United States is Southwest Airlines. And they're the largest airline in Kansas City, and they're interested in bringing more flights here. In the past, we've had airlines that have been the largest carriers for us, and it's been a storied past. TWA merged into American, and that sort of went the way it went, and Braniff was here. And so I think it's very unique for us in the sense that, and exciting in a sense, that Southwest, the largest carrier and the most successful from a business standpoint, is our largest carrier and is interested in expanding here. And its voice isn't the lone voice. All the airlines are very much interested in a single terminal because they think they'll be able to serve Kansas City better, and that's what they would really like to see occur. So.
Southwest loves Kansas City. They love it. No pun intended.
Okay.
Maybe a little.
Thanks for coming out. It is good information. My question is really kind of building on the last one.
Sure.
You have mentioned that the pro forma is speculative and there's no commitment for additional flights. And so I'm just curious, with the financing that you've imagined, you've talked about public and private. When it comes to the public financing, what is the ultimate backstop for that financing if it underperforms? Is that general bond exposure, revenue bond exposure? Kansas City has some very serious infrastructure needs. So I would just be curious to know that it's not going to impact ultimately some of those infrastructure needs, something that's happened like in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for example.
That's a great question, Joe.
Well, I'll just speak to the public financing side. So yeah, I know, right? That went quick to me. Some of you guys know this better than I do. But in my past life, I know a little bit about it. What we understand in aviation facility revenue bonds is that those bonds do not require a general pledge of any sort from the city itself. So, and I have read this. I mean, they can get rated and they can be sold on the market without the city participating with any tax dollars whatsoever. There's a market enough there that if they're structured correctly, that the city's not pledging to backstop those. They're literally the bondholders' source of revenue is solely the revenue generated at the enterprise, the airport itself. The city could issue other series of bonds that would have general pledges, but the ones that are typically used are ones that do not include that, and that would not just be in Kansas City. That would be across the country in the United States, as we understand.
And by federal law, all the revenue that's generated on airport has to stay there. And the airlines have said, we will back these bonds based on their pro formas, looking at it, revenue coming in from the gate leases all the way through.
Okay, so I'm hopeful that maybe one day we'll join other cities with like light rail. And I was wondering if the airport has any, of course that's not on the table right now, but if the airport is going to be designed such that could be added easily if we ever get to that point.
I ran the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority for a year, and I'm a big believer in public transit. And I've got to say, this question comes up very often, and I love it. In Kansas City, there's a lot of people that are interested, if they start thinking about our future, that they start thinking about what mass transit connection should be to an airport, and should it be rail. So that's not part of any proposal, as we understand it. I mean, those are being presented to the City Council in closed session today. However, I think contemplating and thinking about how to connect mass transit to the airport would be an important thing for us all to be vocal about as this continues to move forward, because I think transit and different ways of moving people through a city of the size of Kansas City is changing radically. And our competition, just like we're talking about our competition making investments in airports and aviation, our competition in mid-sized cities, the cities that are doing great things, are looking at and funding multimodal transit systems that are far beyond where we are in Kansas City today. So, I mean, I would echo your interest, and we certainly know that this, and the city understands that, because they've heard a lot of this feedback too, that there's a lot of members of the public that want to understand the future transit plans for KCI and a more robust connection to the airport is certainly in the conversation, but not, as we understand it, a part of any specific proposal right now.
One more question. Tammy said one more.
I had a question.
Yeah.
When you talk about the difference between pickup and drop-off, one of the things people really like about Kansas City, again, is the area of drop-off and pick-off. What is the size difference with the new airport with the old airport? I mean, actual linear footage.
That one we'll have to come back to you on.
I think that gets directly into the how and why. So I suspect some of the proposals that the city is looking at today in the oral presentations have that kind of thing, talk about the convenience of pickup and drop-off in a way that might get as specific as you. All we can tell you is conceptually what the city's asked for. We don't know what those might be in a specific proposal.
You should be reading more about that coming in.
I would fully expect so.
Yes. Well, that's our presentation.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We're so glad to be with you, and thank you, Esther.
Thanks, Esther.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Tim. That was very instructive. I want to thank all of you for coming to show your interest in this very important issue for our city and for our bank. Great questions that you have. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther.